Enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sara, a conversationalist. I am pleased to be in the company of Rabbi Paula Winnig, who just completed her year as serving as the interim rabbi and spiritual leader for the congregation Achduth. Her vocation as a rabbi has included, in addition to serving as the spiritual leader for a variety of congregations, that she has had several positions in Jewish education and served as a prison chaplain. Rabbi Winnig also has a BA in political science, an MBA. She once owned a flock of sheep. She is a fiber artist and is known to be a very good cook and a bicyclist. I am very excited to be able to have a conversation with her. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have a BA in political science, an MBA. Why did you become a rabbi?
Well, actually, the MBA came much later while I was a rabbi. I went back to school at age 47 to get my MBA, which was an interesting experience in and of itself. I could barely see the symbols on the calculator that I needed to use to do my homework.
Right.
But I became a rabbi. The journey to become a rabbi really did start with my BA in political science. I had gone to college planning to save the world. I was going to be an international human rights attorney or something like that. That was my vocation. That was where I thought I was going. And I used to take all these vocational tests that they would give us in high school, and it kept telling me I was going to be a priest. And I laughed. They can't even get the religion right. They can't get the, gender, nothing. I kept saying, I know how to do that. And every time I took one of those tests, it kept telling me I was going to be a priest. And I didn't think anything of it. I went on to my semesters at the University of Wisconsin, and I was in all sorts of activist groups. And at a certain point, there was a tone in some of the activism that made me a little uncomfortable. I wasn't certain how people felt. I guess the best way to describe it is that, so the radar was like clicking away at me saying, this path is important, but maybe it's not for you. And then when there was a time when the Nazi Party tried and was successful to get a permit to march through Skokie. I am completely a freedom of speech advocate, and I think everybody has a right to speak. I still think it was an incredibly horrendous act for them to want to walk through Skokie, Illinois, which at the time had a large population of Holocaust survivors.
One of the largest.
And it brought up a lot of issues. And how far can you go in one direction as a Jewish woman? How far can you get involved? And so that was like running around in my head. And then I tell this story all the time. The author Chaim Potok came to speak, and I had learned so much from him over the years. I had delved into his characters and was just totally in awe being able to sit and listen to him. And in that talk, he mentioned how all of his characters had to struggle with the boundaries of their Jewish upbringing in order to learn to think and grow as human beings. And I realized that night that I needed to do the exact opposite, that I needed to learn more about my Jewish tradition and learn more about what my tradition really had to teach me. And that the best way to do that would be to become a rabbi, because then I could work from the Jewish side to all my social activism. So I decided that night I was going to become a rabbi. I didn't know how you became one.
And were you fluent in Hebrew or?
I had some Hebrew education, but I was definitely not fluent at the time. And the next day I went to the library, because that's where you go and do research in those days. You couldn't Google anything. So I went to the library, looked up rabbi in the graduate school indexes, found some schools, wrote some letters, and that began my journey. And I finally found out how you become a rabbi. And then went to rabbinical school right after college. And as we say, the rest is history.
And so which book of Chaim Potak's, because the two are The Chosen.
The Chosen.
And My Name is Asher Lev.
Well, there's also The Promise. And the book In the Beginning. All of them are wonderful books. But the Chosen, of course, is the most famous. Right. The Promise is the sequel to The Chosen. Okay. It was originally one book, and they split it into two. But it was just the struggles, the way the characters, were coming aware of what was outside of their milieu. I knew it was outside. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know as much about what was inside. Right. And so I went to learn it.
And you grew up in a small community.
I grew up in Wausau, Wisconsin. It was a very small, first of all, it was a small town. It was 32,000 people. And the Jewish community had about 50 or so families. A couple of them were my cousins and my great aunt. Mm-hmm. So I was related to a large portion of the Jewish community of Wausau at the time. But it was, my parents made a very big effort to make certain we knew who we were. And if there was something going on at the synagogue, we were there because there were 6 of us. And if you needed a group, right, we came well grouped. And that was important. And they taught me about commitment to community, commitment to Judaism. They both were dedicated Zionists. My father used to travel the entire state of the upper part of Wisconsin, finding Jews and getting them to contribute to the United Jewish Appeal. And my mother taught and created the religious school program when we didn't have a rabbi or anybody to do that. She and my father would teach, and the big thing is they would go and buy donuts, and all the students would come to our house. And that was just what I was raised with.
So, clearly you're very determined. And to illustrate that, so when you turned 50, mm-hmm, you decided that you were going to stop coloring your hair and let it go gray, which it looks great, by the way. When you turned 55, you set the goal that you were going to participate in 2 mini triathlons, which I'm assuming you accomplished.
I did.
And so you turned 60 last year.
Yes.
So what was the goal for 60?
Actually, the goal for 60, I didn't actually set one. Except that I wanted to be at the end of this year healthier than when I started, and I definitely have been. Thankfully, to Pure Movement Pilates Studio, I've been going there and getting my body healed and in shape, and that's been wonderful. But the big thing was for my 60th birthday, I was really wanting to do an around the world trip. But that didn't happen because I decided to be sensible, and Fort Wayne called, and I decided to come.
Because they needed an interim.
They needed an interim rabbi. Right. I was supposed to take my son and my future daughter-in-law on a cruise to Alaska. It was going to be our 120-year celebration because they're each turning 30 and I turned 60, and 120 is the number of years that Moses lived and is how long. We always wish people, happy birthday until 120. So I thought that was a great thing. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, our cruise has been put on hold for I don't know how long.
So, well, you still have it. You can plan for another.
We'll see what happens. As I said, I'm in my family, unfortunately, my sister and my father both died at 62 and a half.
Okay.
And my brother at 62 and a half was diagnosed with cancer. Thank God he's fine. He made it to 63 and beyond. And so I'm watching watching and making certain.
But you're only 61, so
I know,
you got
60. I want to get to 60. 63. I'll be comfortable.
Okay. So one of the things that I want to start talking to you about is this idea of the difference between faith and religion, because especially when people talk about like interfaith dialogue, or they don't. It seems to me that they're designating a difference between faith and religion. Would you say that that's true, or why are they saying interfaith versus interreligion?
Religious? That's actually a really interesting point. I think it has more to do with semantics than actual ideology. Interfaith is looking at the fact that people can be of different faith backgrounds and maybe not be actively engaged in religious practice. That might be a difference.
I mean, what I thought partly is, everybody has talked about that. The reality of it is that millennials are not interested in organized religion. So they are not joining any type or affiliating with anything. But yet they are spiritual. So I thought that maybe the movement towards faith is because of that spirituality. And also I thought that maybe because they're not looking for the doctrine of organized religion, that also talks about why mindfulness and meditation has become so popular, because again, that's sort of getting in touch with your spirituality or your inner sense of being or finding yourself. And so I thought maybe that was why the shift is going more now to talk about faith.
I think those are all really excellent points. I think the millennial joining situation is really interesting. Because if you look on any social media platform, you find 1,000 groups for anything that you think of. So it's interesting to me that they want to join those kinds of groups. So they're not joining. What they're joining is things that feel like you can come and go more anonymously, perhaps. You can have short-term relationships intensely in those groups, and then, as we say, ghost them and go someplace else.
Right.
So I think that we're seeing an interesting shift in everything. And of course, with quarantine and the pandemic, with every religious community in the country and around the world having to figure out how you reach out to people, what we are finding is in fact that more people are connecting with the materials that the religious organizations, for example, are putting out on the internet, and they're connecting, and we're getting 10, 100 times more people connecting to our content than we were if we would be doing it in person.
And do you think that's partly because, because they also are saying that it's not just religious organizations.
Right.
I mean, millennials, they're not joining service organizations. They don't even want to join golf courses or country clubs or anything. They want things that are sort of from the comfort of their home and that they can sort of tune in and, it's sort of like tune in, drop out kind of thing. Right. So do you think that's why this?
I also think it has to do with the fact that people want to, we're used to right now on-demand material.
Right.
And that's been going on for a while. And being on the internet now means that you can see things a lot of times when you want. I happen to be one of those people who loves that. I love not having to plan my life around, I have to see this broadcast at this time. The sad part of it is that means that people don't have a common conversation anymore. When a program used to be on Sunday night at 9 o'clock that was really popular, everybody would watch it, and on Monday you would go to work and you would converse about those
Right, that
things.
was the water cooler. And that also television actually was able to be a common denominator for generations. Like, right. If you all could talk about, like, the Brady Bunch or the Partridge Family, that was a way to unify different generations, right. Which you don't have anymore.
Although, surprisingly, what's happening is that, again, these things spark up. So there's been some television programs, particularly the program Unorthodox, for example, that got very big press, and everybody's watching it, and there's 12 programs that you can watch, and interviews with the actress and all, interviews with the author, and there is a created conversation despite all these disconnections. And I think that we're just beginning to learn how we can harvest all of this. And the synagogue world is trying to figure this all out. We're in obviously a big transition. No matter when we can be back in person, everybody has become aware of the power of distance learning. I think it's really interesting because 10 years ago when I first moved to Indianapolis, I created a distance learning program so that students who lived too far away from where we were teaching could participate in the program. And I had done my MBA, was partially an online program as well. And I had been involved in distance learning. And now, of course, everybody, oh, did you know that you could do that? Yeah. It's been around for a while, but it's a really great medium. And there's no question that we can reach people now in ways we couldn't. And we've now got to rethink what it means to be an in-person hybrid type framework going forward in a way that most synagogues hadn't done. There's many synagogues have been live streaming for a while,
right.
But now we're getting better services for our live streaming. We'll be able to harness more connections, and I think it's a really exciting time. Institutions are meant to be challenged to be at their best, and this world we're in now is teaching us to do religion differently. So we'll see where we come out on the other side. It's the challenge that was placed before us is being met really creatively and with following. So what that means for future connections will be very interesting to see.
So you spent a year in Fort Wayne. So what are your observations about Fort Wayne? What are some of the things that you've noticed or that you sort of recognize as very interesting or unique to Fort Wayne?
I got to Fort Wayne just as Promenade Park was opening, and the downtown had many construction projects that are going on and revitalizing the whole downtown, and I've lived downtown through all of this. And it's been very exciting to see the sort of the freshening up and some of the businesses and things that are coming in trying to claim the downtown as a destination, and it's working. The Promenade Park is definitely working and admired. It's always very full, sometimes right now, for me, a little too full. But I have had the most fun walking along the Greenway River trails. I've been biking them. So it's been a really wonderful time to be here. Mm-hmm. And of course, there was a lot of great arts performances. I had bought tickets for everything before I came. Unfortunately, I didn't get to see most of them. But it's been really fun. It's also been, especially the past few weeks, there's just been a resurgence of interest and activism, which is nice to see. And where that's going to go in the future and how that is going to be built on by the civic institutions, I think is really fascinating and wonderful. And it's really just been a wonderful, nice year.
So one of the things, obviously, they've done really well with like Promenade Park and the revitalization of downtown is to make it more welcoming. But when you look at Fort Wayne as the city and the institution of it, you know, it's referred to as the city of churches. And there were over 300 churches. Right. I mean, there will be some debate with the lack of millennials going to, organize what's going to happen. But how do you think that idea, that it is the city of churches, do you think that hurts or helps it being welcoming to people of other faiths or backgrounds?
Well, I always joke that it's a city of 350 churches, a few mosques, and a synagogue. Listen, I think having faith communities is a wonderful thing, whatever the faith community is. And there's no question of the incredible commitment of some of the faith leaders in this community. I've had a great deal of love and affection from the Interfaith Clergy Council that I'm part of. We originally met once a month for coffee, and then when the pandemic started, we started meeting every week so that we could keep tabs on things. We gathered together to have a prayer vigil when George Floyd was murdered, because we wanted to bring a sense of prayerful connection rather than just anger and protest, which is certainly called for in all of this. But also during the pandemic, we wanted to make certain we could create something that would be a safe event for people to come to. They've just been wonderful. People are really aware of each other. We gather for Thanksgiving every year, and I think that there's a real sense of camaraderie and affection between the clergy, which then will carry over. We've been making certain that we're all aware of what the different institutions are doing during the pandemic, and just being great support for each other. And they're working to create some really great community conversations now about race,
right,
and activism.
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
So I'm really proud of that group, and I think that the city of churches, why not? I will say that I actually like the park system. I would love them to promote the parks even more than they do, and the waterfront,
right?
Because it's really stunning.
Right, and it used to not be. I mean, the rivers here were perceived as something you needed to be protected from and walled off from, and now that people are embracing it, that's a whole new shift that 50 years ago they didn't have. So maybe they're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I'm just really disappointed that the sewer construction project isn't done, so I really can't see how you get from one place to another in Fort Wayne, because it's been very circular trying to find my way around.
Right, yeah.
And I haven't been able to bike the entire river trail because it's blocked off. But I'll come back.
Good. So one of the things is you're a spiritual leader of a small and diminishing minority religion wherever you are a rabbi. But in Fort Wayne, several things have sort of happened. I mean, Fort Wayne had the Achduth Vesholom was the oldest Jewish congregation in Indiana. You used to have two congregations, and because of diminishing demographics, they actually merged when you came.
Same day I came.
And that no one knows an official count of the number of Jews in Fort Wayne, but they say that there's less than 700 affiliated, which means they're members of the temple. So how does the fact that it is diminishing and the number is really small here, how does that impact how you lead as a rabbi?
It's coming to Fort Wayne was almost like going back to where I came from in Wausau. Small but mighty. When there's a communal event, people come to it. When we do the corned beef sale, which is one of the big signature programs of the congregation, there were 150 or so volunteers that came and helped. Not all Jewish, by the way, but people came because it's a signature program that helps the temple, and everybody came. 1,500 people came to eat. I mean, it was an amazing thing to see how the connections have been built over the years. The synagogue population is going to depend on a couple of things. We do have a significant number of younger families who are moving to Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne has a reputation of being a great place to live. People can have houses and land and things that they can't have in other places, and a lifestyle you can't have in other places. And we get calls almost once a month of somebody who's looking for a job, and it might bring them here, and what's the Jewish community like? So there's still the possibility that there may be some growth to at least keep the number viable. Okay. The merger of the two congregations has been an interesting challenge, much bigger challenge and much more activity around it than I think anybody expected when they engaged me to come here. But I can say really proudly that they have moved well down the way of a very nice integration. And they created the slogan when the merger happened of one congregation, two traditions. Right,
because it wasn't the fact that it wasn't that the issues were not that Jews versus Jews. It was that one was more reformed and one was more conservative in their approach to practicing Judaism.
Right. And we're finding some very nice ways to integrate that in a healthy and beautiful way. And I'm just hopeful that it will continue and be vibrant. And again, since the pandemic, we've been able to see more people who weren't coming in person who are now coming online. So I think the future is pretty bright. I don't think the congregation's going to diminish to a point where it can't exist. But of course, a large portion of the community is aging.
Right.
A large portion of the community is also, some of them are needing to relocate to be closer to family and things. So it's hard. But one of the things I learned about small town Jews is that they want to stay connected. They need each other for that spiritual, personal connection. And there's only one place to get it now in the community. And I'm hopeful that it will continue.
I mean, the reality of it is, though, the number of American Jews is declining. We used to be 2% of the population. We're now 1%. And one of the things that you said that partly why there is a decline in the Jewish congregants here is because some who grew up Jewish, they leave to go either to pursue schooling in their careers, or they want a bigger community in which maybe to be Jewish and meet, their mate and partner. But again, going back to what's happening with millennials, what's happening though is even though lots of children grew up surrounded in the Jewish faith, as adults, they are not becoming, if they move somewhere, affiliated or getting involved with, their religious faith. And a lot of when I spoke to some of the churches about what they're doing with millennials, they sort of believe the idea that they'll get them back when they have children. When they have children, that becomes, you start to join. And clearly you see that with the temple. But now that's not necessarily always a given because people are finding they don't want it.
Well, I think the age gap of membership is now much smaller. So I used to say that, God dies after the bar mitzvah and God reappears in somebody's life around the time they're having their first child. The biggest that used to be then a gap of maybe 10 years of involvement. Now we're looking at more like 20 years because people are having children so much later. And that is a problem. It's a significant problem financially. One of the things we know about the pandemic is that besides the economic collapse that harmed a lot of people, it's also making people reassess where they put their dollars and their involvement and what they can get for free versus paid. But I will say one of the other things that's been interesting about some of the online offerings is that people are actually not charging and offering for you to make a donation, and they are seeing that people are paying more that way than if they had charged.
Well, they've done that with a restaurant for people that they wanted to raise money for the homeless. So it's whatever you wanted to donate, whatever you felt the meal was worth.
Right.
And they actually found that people would give more than if they actually just had to pay a bill.
Exactly.
So it's that value of how you value something.
And I think synagogue membership structures have been evolving for decades. And many of them are going to sort of free will kind of things and are sustaining it. Others are, have other formulas. But clearly the institutions are going to be reassessing their staff, their buildings, and all sorts of things. And we will see synagogues and churches consolidating and collapsing. I'm moving to Youngstown, Ohio, and that's also a community that used to be a much larger Jewish community, and it's now consolidating as well.
Yeah, I mean, based on I was talking about what you would think you would bring from what you learned in Fort Wayne to your new position in Youngstown. So Youngstown is a city of 65,000. 49% are white. 42% are African American, and your Jewish population is less than 3,000, and just like here, really declining. But the interesting thing with Fort Wayne is that it is a city of about 268,000 people. 73% are white, 14.9% are African Americans. Youngstown has a Hispanic population of 11%. Fort Wayne is 8.9, and we have less than affiliated, who recognize themselves as 700. Yeah. So I am sort of curious about how you think that your work here in Fort Wayne will help you and maybe give you some insight into what you can bring to your next.
Well, the most important thing is that I've experienced this merger firsthand, and some of the pitfalls along the way for a community going through this kind of situation. And that, of course, is going to be a major part of what I'll be helping with in Youngstown, is helping the community work on this collaboration that they're creating and hopefully help them avoid some of the pitfalls by helping them be more focused on what this means emotionally. One of the problems with mergers for any organization, this is true in business as well, is that they say, oh yeah, this will be perfect. And you do all the businessy things, and then you find out that the culture of the people in the business does not mesh.
Right.
And you end up with an entity that was much weaker than the two separate parts. So not all mergers are good. Right. Not all mergers are done well. But in Youngstown, they have too many buildings for the population of Jews. They can't sustain all the buildings. So one of the big questions is will they simply share facilities, or will they actually become one entity? One of the things about the merger here in Fort Wayne is I think originally they were much more focused that it was going to be more of separate but equal.
Right.
And I think that one of the things I was very helpful at doing was getting everybody to understand that it's not separate. We just do things differently, but it is one community.
Right.
And really hammering that home. So I'm hopeful that I'll be able to be successful and helpful when I go to Youngstown.
So with the idea of looking at one community, clearly with everything that's been going on with the racism protests and having to look at this idea of systemic and institutional racism, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, well, it's threefold. There's the idea of race versus ethnicity, which traditionally is where you would think of culture and religion. Okay. But there's also the issue from a Jewish standpoint that we wanted so much to make sure that we separate, that we are not a race, we are a religion. Because there was a time in Nazi Germany when they really tried to prove or convince people that we were a race. So when you look at this situation with racism and happening now, how do you sort of look at defining race versus ethnicity and this difficulty of where Judaism and Jews fit in, because we are not a race, we are a religion, but how does that influence, how racism is perceived? And partly what I say is that we have to have anti-Semitism, because if we were a race, we would just be part of racism. So along those lines also is this issue of racism versus anti-Semitism. And so I'm curious to see what you sort of take on that is.
So I would start with saying that anti-Semitism is part of racism. And it's a really interesting history, how Jews went from being a group that stood out, that people protested against, made housing laws so Jews couldn't live near them,
right,
etc. And now we're just seen as white.
Well, but now we're being seen as white Jewish people. So, I mean, I want to break that out about what's happening with anti-Semitism, but looking at in terms of, let's just racism versus ethnicity versus anti-Semitism.
Right. So it's one of these puzzling things as a Jew, how we suddenly got grouped with all those other just plain white people. And it was interesting. I had when I lived in Auckland, New Zealand, I had the experience of spending time with a Maori group on the marae. And I actually took the Torah scroll and had a Shabbat worship service with our community, with the Maoris on the marae. And we talked, I explained the service, and I led everybody past the Torah through a big circle of people. And at the end of the service, one of the members of this Maori group came over to me and said, we used to think you were just Pakehas, which is the Maori word for whites. You're white Europeans. But now we understand that you're not, you're different because you have a different spirituality than everybody else. So I've kept that notion in my mind that it's not that we're an ethnicity.
Okay.
We are, but there is something that is different. We used to joke about Jewish geography, that you could walk into a room and you would know immediately.
It was before the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. Right. We had Jewish geography.
Well, I always say that Jews only have 1.5 degrees of separation, just enough to make certain you don't marry your first cousin. So we would go into a room and you knew. And the funny thing is I had this friend in college who I knew when I met her was Jewish, but she wasn't. She had been raised, she didn't admit to any of it. And then I met her parents, and afterwards she said, so I really have to tell you, I really am Jewish, and blah, blah. Well, I knew it despite the fact that they had done everything. They had been raised with Christmas and raised going to the Unitarian church instead of a synagogue. But there was something in her. And I've had that experience 1,000 times in my lifetime. We're definitely not a race because Jews really are of every race. Right. The estimate actually, which is really interesting right now, is a big debate over how many people of color are also Jewish.
Right, because there are very big groups in Africa. They're the Falasha Jews, and
Right. So. But it was really focused on America, because we have lots of people of different colors and different races who are also Jewish, and that's created an interesting phenomena for us Jews, which is one of the reasons why race doesn't work for us. There is no Jewish look. There may be a look that it was prominent because of the Eastern European Jews who came and settled in America, blah blah, but. We are a mixed ethnic group. So I think Judaism is about religion and religious practices, but it's also about some sort of inner spiritual connection that is just there.
Well, I also say it's values. It's the values that you sort of what's important, and the values of like education and working hard and being able to question things. And I think that's where I feel is the sort of what makes it different.
Questioning and arguing, certainly.
Right.
Unfortunately, the sad thing about the whole values thing is, of course, I was raised by my parents to think, all Jews were good and all. And then you meet, a Bernie Madoff,
right?
Who used his religious observance as a cover to prey on people.
Right.
So, unfortunately, not everybody has Jewish values who is Jewish, but there is a sense of difference and sense of connection. And it's one of the hardest things when I would teach at Jewish summer camps and we'd talk about these kinds of issues. Someone would say, well, that makes us racist. Well, if we talk about being connected to Jews and working, well, that makes us racist because we're not being involved with other people. And that's actually one of the things I think that's interesting about the conversations that we're having now in our country, is that we need to own our own selves, and our whole selves. Whatever we are all of those things, and we bring all of those things to the table.
Right.
And when we had the prayer vigil, one of the things I talked about was the fact that I understand my privilege. I understand that I am never questioned walking down a street. I'm an old lady now, they look at me, oh, okay, you're fine, all the time. nobody, or they ignore me because
Right.
that's what happens to older women, but they don't ever question who I am. I never am going to be a suspect just because I'm walking down a street.
No, just because you're walking down the street. But there is the issue of the anti-Semitism, and it could be subtle and it could be blatant. So, and it is growing. So you may not be looked at as a suspect, but you could be suspect
Right.
of how people view you.
Oh, exactly. The anti-Semitic events that are going on
Yeah.
in the country right now are horrendous.
Right.
There's something like a 3,000-fold increase in the past year of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States, and they're not just, oh, we're going to taunt you, or they're painting something on
No.
the side of a building. They are physical assaults
Yeah. No.
and murders.
Yeah.
It's really a scary time. And one of the things we talk about is how, the first thing all the synagogues did across the country was get extra security.
Right.
And there were some discussions about, well, what's that going to do to people who have some suspicion or some bad experiences with police officers when they see that their synagogue has them there?
Right.
And it's a hard question, and it's a hard balance in our
Yeah.
country. And one of the things we've had to realize, I used to say, oh, small town, nobody's going to come. Well, unfortunately, small town is exactly where this is happening.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think what you have to also, when you're going to talk about the incidents of anti-Semitism, you have to look at those are anti-Semitic hate crimes, okay?
Yes.
So according to the FBI, in 2014, there were 609. In the height was 2017, when there was 938. In 2018, we saw that there was an increase to 835. For 2019, the numbers are not out. It's projected to have a 20% increase. And the preliminary data for 2019 from the Anti-Defamation League says that New York will have a record of the most anti-Jewish hate crimes since 1992. Yep. But I think that also, again, in those numbers, you have to separate out anti-Semitic hate crimes versus anti-Semitism itself, because a lot of it is not this blatant against. And so, one of the things that when we look at talking about anti-Semitism, you've spent your career in promoting the importance of Jewish education through interfaith dialogue, getting to know other people's religions, understanding where you come from, having experiences that, sort of like you felt that you had when you were in college. But what's happening, though, is the issues on college campuses today, and this whole anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Israel. And part of what they're saying is that it's because they're using it under the guise of academic expression or First Amendment, that it's like the student activism, but it's really perpetuating anti-Semitism. So where does that all fall in, and what's happening in terms of the lack of education or awareness, and why is there such a resurgence of the anti-Semitism on college campuses?
Unfortunately, it's because of a narrow understanding of history, a narrow understanding of actually what happens on the ground. And it's very hard. It's very sad. It's heartbreaking to see some of the way activism is expressing itself. There is no question that the government of Israel has some very difficult views on how they handle the Palestinian population. There is no question that there is a problem with equality and safety for the Palestinian people who live there. There's also no question that there has not been a political solution that has worked to make things better. And the rhetoric that people carry from that political reality depends very much on who you're listening to. And unfortunately, like every social activist group, you're going to pick what works and you're going to say what works. One of the things we joke about is they talk about how Israel is an apartheid state. And one of the things that, comes out of the rhetoric from the Israeli side is if we're an apartheid state or we're committing genocide, we are the worst people ever, since the Palestinian and the Arab population has increased dramatically in that time. So Israel couldn't possibly be committing genocidal acts. There is a separation. There is no question about it. I abhor much of it. I abhor the wall that was built. But I also abhorred the fact that people couldn't ride a bus in security because of the fear of being bombed as they were going places.
Or parents who put their kids on school buses.
And parents, families used to split up. The two spouses wouldn't go to the same social event just in case, so they wouldn't die at the same time and leave their children orphans. That was really the emotional calculation people were living with. I know it's not happening now. There has to be a political solution. And the current government of Israel is probably not going to be the one to find it. And it breaks my heart on a regular basis. But the pickup from that, to be anti-Israel or to be in favor of a Palestinian state, is very different than calling Jews murderers, than saying Jews are using the Holocaust to prey on other people. I mean, that rhetoric is just awful. The sad thing is it works. And we know it works because we see the white supremacist material. We see the anti-Israel material coming around. The good news is that much of that stuff that's going on campus when they try to have meetings and get the university to do this or do that is almost always been voted down. The academics, I'm appalled at because the whole point of academic learning is interactions, and to have preconceived notions of what people are going to say or do is an abhorrent academic viewpoint to me. And I'm ashamed to think that college professors who are supposed to be teaching and educating are holding lines that are just blatantly wrong. I do think there is a difference when you are you become privileged and you gain something from hurting others, and then there may be a case for a boycott. But it still really bothers me that academicians are the ones creating a lot of the fuss when they're the ones that should be teaching people to think better. And they need to be more open themselves.
I mean, but again, going back to this idea of institutionalized and systemic, I mean, part of the problem is that the Israel and the fact that, everything that when the media, they talk about how many bombs that Israel sent, to Gaza, but they don't talk about what Gaza sent back, in the murders. And then you have, this idea of, still with this anti-Israel, but partly why Israel has to hold such a strong sort of view as a Jewish state and for the Jewish people is because there are still countries in this world who have openly said they just want to wipe it off the face of the earth. And so people don't get it. And they don't understand that and that's sort of what I wanted to brings me to talking about the relationship between American Jews and African Americans. Now, on the surface, you would think that we would be, and there was a time during the civil rights movement when Jews were a lot that went on down for the freedom rides, and they were the ones, they actually were murdered. And because they also felt that, we identified, we were slaves in Egypt, they are slaves in America. They had to deal with Jim Crow laws. Well, we had to deal with quotas and, where they could live. I mean, in 1970, when my parents moved to Miami Beach, Florida, there were two areas. There was Bal Harbor and Bay Harbor. The Jews could not live in Bal Harbor. Now, you would say, how would they do that? Well, You couldn't get a bank loan. You couldn't join the country club there. So this is 1970. So all the Jews lived in Bay Harbor.
Right.
So you would say, okay, so, we weren't accepted in certain civil organizations or country clubs. We were persecuted.
Right.
I mean, and, I actually found out that there was actually a lynching, of a Jewish person in Atlanta in 1913 who was accused of murder. So you would think that there would be a lot of similarities and that there would be more of a united front. Yet that's not what you're seeing now, and especially, in the current state with also Black Lives Matter. Because when you look at Al Sharpton, and he's out there, at the rallies and promoting, but he is innately, he hasn't, owned up to his own anti-Semitic rhetoric.
He hasn't. I actually knew Al Sharpton when I lived in New York. A lot of people get a lot of attention. If you want to get attention in this country, be a spokesperson and then make an anti-Semitic statement, and you'll get all the attention you want.
Right.
Because we react. We have organizations that do that for us. That it is something that I think in some ways annoys people, that we actually have a system in place now for a long time, that we work together as Jewish people and community to make certain that we have the rights that we have today.
Right.
That's part of the things that, the shift from being Jewish to being white. We are so well assimilated in so many ways that shift has happened, but we still have the watchdogs,
right.
The ADL, the most prominent one, to make certain that we're safe and our rights are being reflected. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the Jewish community's commitment to Black Lives Matter is unequivocal. We have, we stand up as synagogues for people when they're harmed. We do not stand against them. We stand with the Black Lives Matter movement. Mm-hmm. We stand with any people struggling to stay safe, certainly immigrants. It's one of the things that, of course, has been heartbreaking for us the past few years, is the way potential immigrants and asylum seekers are treated coming to the U.S. borders.
Right.
It's a thing that I am absolutely unequivocally supportive of, because I don't think immigration should stop just because my grandparents got here first. And I absolutely cannot bear when somebody forgets that they too are immigrants. And as a joke, whenever somebody talks about some of these land swaps, mm-hmm. I say, whose tribe are you living on? Let's own, if we're going to own up, let's own up all the way.
Right.
And you can't say that somebody else is an usurper when you're sitting in a city where your land was once a Native American holding, right. And they sold it, but they certainly didn't get any mm-hmm. value for it. And I think this is part of the conversation. Everything ebbs and flows based on an incident. One of the things that I'm very interested in seeing that's going on right now is that this George Floyd murder was like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Right.
People are now seeing, because we could see the visual, and some of these other shootings as well, we can see the visuals, and that matters. And people are now being woken up to say, there's how many deaths to black
right.
men in police shootings a year? There's how much of this is going on? And we're seeing book clubs, and the bestseller list this week.
Right.
New York Times bestseller list. Like the first 6 books are all books
yeah.
on racism.
Yeah.
Which is astounding and wonderful, and the conversations will shift mm-hmm. because now people are aware in a way they weren't.
Right.
And the fact that it happened on the heels of the pandemic, when people have a little bit more time on their hands,
right.
Is a really interesting correlation, especially when we know the pandemic hurt people of color mm-hmm. at a much higher rate than it did mm-hmm. people who are white, because of their lack of access to health care, because of their lack of income, because they were frontline workers
Right.
at low-paid jobs. And all of that information is now coming to the forefront.
Right.
And the other interesting thing about the pandemic is we now look at what essential workers are in a very different way.
As well as teachers.
As
Because all
well
the
as
parents
teachers,
are,
as
right.
parents.
They realize the hardest job.
Yeah.
So now you're going to have to then add, you're known as saying words matter.
Yeah.
So now you're going to have to say words and video.
And video.
Matter.
Visuals matter.
Right.
There's
Visuals matter.
They really matter. And, we've caught a lot. I mean, one of the things that's unbelievable and I still can't get my head around with the George Floyd murder is that it was 8 minutes and 46 seconds of people watching.
Right.
And nobody did anything. Right. And to me, that is the most chilling parallel to the Jewish experience.
Right.
And the good news is, though, that people didn't turn. They may have not done anything at that moment. They couldn't save him at that moment.
But they didn't turn a blind eye.
But nobody's turning a blind eye and saying, oh, okay, it happened.
Right.
And that's really important. And that's a huge difference. And that's part of what made it an incident that was, to jar America, because we don't stand for that.
Right.
We are going to take to the streets. We are going to question. We are going to be concerned, because that's not how we do things here. And it's a really nice thing to see that happening. The sad thing is, of course, that the message from the top of this country helps promote racism and separatism and white supremacy.
Yeah.
And I think that has been awful and terrible, but on the other hand, it's keeping people aware. People did not become complacent throughout this time.
Right.
And people had become complacent.
Absolutely.
So, every once in a while, I guess we need a kick in our butts to get us moving again.
Yeah, true. So at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. And Proust believed that by answering these questions, a person reveals his or her true nature.
Oh.
So what is
Maybe we need to leave.
No. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word? Probably absolutely.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
My least favorite word. Wow. I'm not certain I can think of one.
Oh, what about no, can't?
No, I actually, people, I guess it would be, I can't. I can't it would be it.
Now, this one might be easy for you. What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Life, people's experiences, sunsets, sunrises, nature, they all work.
And what turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
People who are obstinate, people who are rude, and when you encounter filth and people who don't care about their environment.
What sound or noise do you love?
I love the singing of birds.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Well, living downtown, I've come to hate the sound of the train, which is really a shame because I really love trains, but that train comes through downtown and is very loud all the time.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I've always wanted to, there's always been that part of me that wanted to do acting or performance in some way.
Well, you do that when you're on
Well, that's what we joke
Bima,
about,
yeah.
that we have the best paid acting job.
Right.
with decent tenure.
Right. What profession would you not like to do?
Of course, now it's an obsolete profession, but I used to say my worst nightmare was to have to stand in a toll booth and where cars would come by and emit all sorts of horrible smoke. I felt always so terrible for those people who did those jobs, and now they're mostly obsolete because mostly it's mechanical
Right.
now.
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
Well, besides my children, who I think are incredible human beings, I think my greatest achievement has been my ability to just bring people together.
And who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Wow. I think I would start with a whole bunch of early women writers, but there's also part of me that would love to have been around for the suffragettes.
And that's perfect timing now because it's the 100th.
Yeah.
Yeah. How would you like to die?
I would like to die while my brain is still functional and my body is functional. I got that from my parents, and I would like to be able to know enough to have time to say goodbye.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Well, in Judaism, it's actually not pearly gates. It's the Garden of Eden, paradise.
So when you get ready at the gates
I would just like to know that I did my best and be honored for having done the best I could to make the world better.
Well, I want to thank Rabbi Winnig for such an engaging and insightful conversation. Please join me next time when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.